So just a few days ago, Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, a more centrist Democrat in Congress, announced her intentions to run for governor of Virginia in 2025, which now leaves an open House seat in Virginia's 7th congressional election. Now, to be clear, of course, she's still going to fulfill the rest of her term in Congress, but of course, in 2024, there's going to be an open primary on the Democratic side, meaning there will be no incumbent for this seat. So a race that is still 2 years off has some implications in next year's House election. So we're going to talk about briefly the Virginia 2025 governor's race. Again, this is extremely early, over 2 years out. And then we're going to talk about the implications this has on the 2024 House map. And of course, this seat, having been left open with no incumbent, does provide opportunity for Republicans to capture this seat and potentially hold on to the House in 2024. So we're going to get into all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So as I mentioned earlier, Abigail Spanberger is more of a centrist Democrat. She's been staunchly against the whole defund the police movement on the more left-wing side of the Democratic Party. And overall, she's a more moderate voice in Congress in general. She does break party ranks sometimes to vote on legislation with Republicans, but by and large, she still is very much a partisan Democrat. But her running for governor of Virginia is important because it could potentially clear the Democratic field, considering Democrats probably want to avoid a messy primary in order to give themselves the best chance of actually winning the governorship in 2025. Now, of course, Governor Glenn Youngkin, who's currently the popular Republican governor of Virginia, cannot run for re-election as per Virginia's constitution, which only allows governors to run for one consecutive term. Of course, they can run after that, but they have to leave a term in between if they want to run for a second term. So if Glenn Youngkin wanted to run for governor again, his earliest opportunity would be in 2029. But now that Abigail Spanberger is running for governor, it does leave a completely open field for Virginia's 7th congressional district. Now, in terms of the Democratic primary in this congressional district, we already have some big names that are running to replace Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger. You have Hala Ayala, who was the Democrats' nominee for lieutenant governor back in 2021. She lost to Winsome Sears by about 1.5 points. So looking ahead at 2024, that's certainly a potential option. You also have Jennifer Carroll Foy, who actually ran in the primary against Terry McAuliffe for governor back in 2021. She currently has her state Senate district lined up for her in Northern Virginia. But of course, if she decides to run for Congress, it will encompass the 7th district. So those are two big names right off the bat that Democrats could run. On the Republican side, you have Yesli Vega, who was the nominee who ran against Spanberger the last time. Now, she lost by about 4 percentage points back in 2022 to Spanberger. Now, one of the reasons that Vega lost by such a considerable margin in a district that really should have been about 50-50 was because of her poor margins in the exurban counties. Stafford County, she only won by around 150 votes. You have Spotsylvania County, which she only won by 8 points. These are counties, when you compare them to Youngkin's performance, that were won by Youngkin by nearly 11 points. And of course, in the case of Spotsylvania County, by over 20 percentage points. So you have a massive underperformance in those exurban counties, and that's one of the reasons why Yesli Vega ended up losing. And part of the reason for that was her stance on abortion, or at least her poor messaging on the issue. And I think abortion is still going to be somewhat relevant in the 2024 elections, even if it's not the most pressing issue, especially in these exurban counties that are growing rapidly, that are getting more liberal. And, you know, this sort of hardline stance against abortion that Vega perpetuated is not really a winning position in these districts. And that sort of hardline stance against abortion, who I think she had a comment similar to Tudor Dixon's, which of course is just poison when it comes to the suburbs, but it really doesn't work in these sorts of congressional districts. And even in Culpeper County, places in the rural parts of the district, you know, this is a very exurban, even rural county, you have underperformances all across the board. So Spanberger, of course, being an incumbent certainly helped her. Her district was much closer to Richmond originally, back when she ran in 2020. But of course has since moved up more towards Northern Virginia. So it is a bit of a different district, but this does still have a more Democratic bent to it. And of course, Republicans are going to have a tricky time winning back this district, especially since Donald Trump is likely to be the Republican nominee at this point in time. And we all know how Donald Trump did in Virginia overall. He lost the state by the largest margin of any Republican since 1944. And I think this trend towards the Democrats in Virginia is going to continue with him at the top of the ticket, which means that it's going to be increasingly more difficult for Republicans to win these swing toss-up suburban districts when you have someone at the top of the ticket who does so poorly in the suburbs. And I think Virginia's 7th is sort of the epicenter of that. It's really the heart of the suburban exurban shift in favor of the Democrats, because Youngkin was able to win Virginia's 7th by several points. But of course, since then, Republicans have failed to recapture it. Now, looking ahead at 2024, the way the race is shaping up, you have a candidate, again, at the top of the ticket, Donald Trump, who at this point in time would probably lose to Joe Biden and, of course, would drag down Republicans down ballot. Now, that doesn't mean that Donald Trump is doomed to lose for certain. Again, we're still over a year and a half away from the general election, but given his unfavorable ratings and, of course, all the news coverage around the indictments, I think it's going to be very difficult for Donald Trump to beat Joe Biden, even with all of Joe Biden's flaws, the stalling economy, and of course you have really low approval ratings among the general public. So Joe Biden and Donald Trump are very, very unpopular. It's really going to be a question in 2024 who's more unpopular. But now shifting gears a bit to 2 years in the future, again, we were talking about earlier Virginia's governor's race. You have a number of candidates that could potentially run on the Republican side. Of course, you have Jason Miyares, who's the current attorney general. He actually won by the smallest margin back in 2021, mainly because he was running up against an incumbent, Mark Herring. He only ended up winning his race by about 0.8%. So this was the closest race in 2021 in Virginia, but it was still a Republican flip nonetheless. So you have him. He's slightly more conservative, I think, than Winsome Sears, who's the lieutenant governor, but both of them have their fans within the GOP. So either one of these nominees, I think, would be fairly strong. I think Jason Miyares would probably be the stronger of these two nominees, since I think he's a bit less controversial than Winsome Sears. But Winsome Sears has actually shifted away a bit from Donald Trump and her more Trumpy optics that she had running in the primary, or the convention, I should say, back in 2021, where she really touted her record as the chairwoman of Trump's re-election campaign in Virginia. It was something like that. She was very much involved in the Trump campaign in Virginia, either in 2016, but I think it was 2020. So that was sort of a focal point. And now you're at the point in time where she's basically saying she won't support Donald Trump in 2024 in the Republican primary. So a big shift there, and I think it's a good shift in a state like Virginia that very much is an anti-Trump state overall. Now on the Democratic side, it isn't necessarily a one-person race. You have Eileen Fillercorn, who was the former Speaker of the Virginia House of Delegates when the Democrats had the majority there for just 2 years. And of course you have LeVar Stoney, who is the current mayor of Richmond. Both pretty big names in Virginia Democratic politics. Spanberger is probably the most centrist of these candidates. So it's really a question of whether or not Virginia Democrats want a Democrat that is more to the left as opposed to somebody more towards the center. Because I think somebody like Abigail Spanberger, as has been shown in Virginia 7th, is a very electable Democrat, is probably a good fit for the state overall, and probably could fix Virginia Democrats' image in the state that's sort of been tarnished since 2021. One of the reasons why you had Youngkin actually win in the first place, because again, this was a race that Democrats really shouldn't have lost. They were running a virtual incumbent Democratic governor in a state that Joe Biden had just won by 10 points. So, you could chalk that up to Terry McAuliffe being a weak candidate, but I think you can also chalk it up to Glenn Youngkin being an exceptional candidate and Virginia Republicans actually having an incredible operation to actually get out the vote in the state and promote their candidates. Because Glenn Youngkin campaigned with Winsome Sears and Jason Miyares. They basically made it a solid, united ticket instead of having all the candidates run separately, which sometimes has happened in the past in Virginia when you've had more split decisions with these other statewide races. Back in 2005, you had Tim Kaine win in the governorship, but you also had a Republican attorney general, I believe potentially a Republican lieutenant governor as well. So you didn't have a split verdict this time around. You actually had Republicans unite around their ticket, and this ultimately also brought Republicans the House of Delegates. So again, 2025 will sort of hinge on what kind of power I think Governor Youngkin has throughout the rest of his term. Again, we still have the legislative elections that will, affect both the House of Delegates and the state Senate. So if Republicans are able to win both of those, they can actually create some real change in Virginia and potentially shake up the dynamic in 2025. But if we continue to have divided government or Republicans lose the House of Delegates, I think it puts Republicans in a much weaker position in the state. So, you have some other factors playing in on the legislative elections as well. I think maybe the Republican primary may somewhat play into that because, again, I think if Democrats think Donald Trump is going to be the nominee again by 2023, they may be more fired up to vote than they otherwise would have been. But, Youngkin and the Virginia Republicans are investing a lot of money in a get out the vote, early vote operation. And, if there's any chance at winning the House of Delegates and the state Senate, it would be through those efforts because Republicans have continually failed to win in the early vote or even make a dent in the Democrats' early vote enough to actually win the overall election. And that's been the Republicans' biggest problem in the Rust Belt in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, where you've seen races since 2020, and 2020 included, where Republicans have a lead in, of course, the in-person vote, and then they lose it over time because they just get absolutely slaughtered in the early vote. So Virginia Republicans are trying to mitigate that and hopefully fix that in an effort to actually get a Republican trifecta in the state. So again, Abigail Spanberger vacating her seat is important because it leaves an open seat and a potential pickup opportunity for Republicans, but ultimately I still think Virginia's 7th will probably lean in favor of the Democrats, especially since it's looking increasingly more certain that Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee a year from now. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. Again, as always, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.